It's on, and we're going to be starting in just a couple of minutes. If you could come in and take your seats, or if you're in, don't leave. Take your seats. Thank you. We'll be right with you. So there was an Irishman, an Englishman, and a Scotsman. And I got a few of your heads to turn. We've been having a very fun day today. I have loved, yes, I am speaking to you. Come in. I've got a whole comedy routine that's coming. But we've had a wonderful day today. Start to where we are now. It was inspiring to hear the opening, and I just came from, I walked in at one point into this room during the lunch meeting, every table packed, everyone talking, doing their own thing. One of the rules of development, you got to let people take control and good things will happen. Well, I think it did. Anyway, you must wonder why I am talking to you while some of you continue your table conversations. My name is Paul O'Brien. I work for Oxfam America. I'm very pleased to be here. I'm particularly pleased to be a board member of SID. And I have the honor of introducing our next speaker. And as long as I talk like this for another 30 minutes, the room should be, well, no, I'm kidding. Okay. This is a fun one, which I think will give you all a sense of what is coming in our world as good development ideas meet creative communications. Simon Moss is the managing director of the Global Poverty Project. He's actually a co-founder of it, along with Hugh Evans, who was here to speak but had lost a family member. So his co-founder agreed at the last minute, and we are very grateful. I have seen Simon on YouTube in the past and strongly encourage you to go watch his 6 Myths About Africa YouTube presentation, which was both educational and entertaining. He has contributed in these ways in many different forums, in the G20, at the World Economic Forum, at the Clinton Global Initiative, and together with Hugh and many of his colleagues at the Global Poverty Project, he's put together this really interesting idea called Global Citizen, and they've got a wham-bam PowerPoint presentation for you to see, and Simon will talk you through it, so I encourage you to take a seat where you can see one of these screens and see Simon and enjoy the next 15 or 20 minutes. A hand for Simon Moss.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks very much, Paul, and thank you all for having me here today. I'm thrilled to be filling in for Hugh, our co-founder. And what I wanted to share with you today were really some reflections, some stories, and some ideas we've been developing about this idea, global citizen. And it starts with, I think, a pretty challenging acknowledgement, which is that we as a sector have a problem. We have a problem with the public. and we have a problem with the government. And that is that right now, not enough of them, I think, get what we do, care about what we do, or agree with what we do. Now, to the extent that any of us can actually agree what it is that we do, which I know can be tricky, what I am conscious of is that we have a public out there, the American public, who, from all of the polling that we've seen, says that they are good people, that they believe in a world that believes in fairness and some form of equality of opportunity, and they want the best for everyone, and they don't want kids dying unnecessarily, and they want a safe and peaceful world. And then you ask them how they're happy to have their tax dollars spent, and they don't want it spent on foreign aid. And so what I wanted to share with you today were some of the things that we've been trying, some of the things that have been working, and some of the big questions and big bets we're making right now about how we think it should all work differently. And they're all based around this idea of Global Citizen, which is an initiative that we run to try and mobilize a movement of tens of millions of people around the world who believe actually that these things I mentioned before, equality of opportunity, freedom of expression, all children getting the chance to survive and thrive, isn't just a slogan, it's a reality. And so this is a story that, for me and for some of the folks that I know, started about a decade ago. Back when we were at college, and admittedly a little naive, back in Australia, a group of us got together and got involved with the Make Poverty History Coalition. And coming off the back of what had happened in Britain, coming off the back of what had happened in America, we put on a bit of a concert. And at the concert, we got together with all the artists we could find. We thought it'd be a small event, and we did it on the margins of what was then a not overly important event called the G20. And there were a bunch of finance ministers there, and we didn't expect any decisions to get made. But off the back of it, we saw the power of what happens when you can link up good political advocacy with good media and grassroots engagement work, as well as good policy work. Over the next 12 to 18 months, there was door knocking, there were more concerts, there was grassroots organising, there were more of all of these things. And together with the sector in Australia, we were able to get the government to double the foreign aid budget. An extra $6.2 billion over 4 years was given, and Australia became one of the top donors to things like Gavi. Australia started doing some really interesting and innovative things with its aid. And then we had a financial crisis. And then the Australian government, first one side of politics, then the other, decided that aid was a bit of an easy target and ripped $12 billion over 4 years out of the foreign aid budget. And to me, that's symptomatic of something broader that's true for all of us, which is that right now, we have political support that extends as far as the next election. And that political support, I'll be honest, I don't think is enough to get us the sort of quality of foreign aid program we want, nor is it enough for us to be able to do some of the really big transformative things. And so for us at Global Citizen, what we've been asking is the question, well, if you've got a public who want to do good, but a political system that's mired in short-termism and doesn't deal well with bigger-than-self issues, how do we do it? And for us, it's based on an insight. It's based on the insight that we live in a fundamentally interconnected planet, and that actually we might have a political system that's tribal, but we have people who increasingly, whether it's through technology, whether it's through travel, whether it's just through the way they understand the world, see that they're connected to people all over the world. And that yes, we're American or Australian or British citizens, but we can also be global citizens. And we need, through our work, to be able to help people realize that, to be able to express that. And we know from the polling that we've already done that actually about 70% of American citizens don't think that they're not global citizens. They're like, yeah, that sounds like the sort of thing that I could be, as long as I don't also have to give up being American. And so what we've been looking at is to say, how do you turn that into something more than just a name and into something that's practical? And we start with the challenge that the diet that most American public have grown up with is of this. Their understanding of international issues is largely through the lens of fundraising, and it's largely through the lens of the sort of fundraising that happened in the 80s and 90s. And even last week when we saw Red Nose Day, a remarkable piece of TV on NBC, we work closely with the guys who put it together. We go talk to them, the highest fundraising pieces are the film clips where the kids die. And that's both awful, because we know that the work we do is about so much more than that. But also, if we're going to make sure we can fund the programs, the work that everyone's doing, people will go towards the things that work best. And so what we've been looking at is to say, how do we get away from this frame alone and towards something that actually captures the positivity, the hope, the progress that we know is actually a part of everything that's been going on? And ultimately, how do we drive people towards engagement? Because engagement is going to be donation, plus it's going to be activism, volunteering, and all of the other things that we know we need the public to do, with ultimately the desire that we change the way that people think about how politics works, that we stop thinking about it just in terms of, can I get enough votes to try and make sure that we don't have another budget that is just a series of continuing resolutions? And we move to a scenario where actually there's enough public support to make sure we've got a half-decent budget set of programs all year round as part of a broader sweep of America playing a role as a fantastic global citizen. So the data for us, we think, is pretty strong. We know right now that although only about a quarter of the public are what we'd call engaged, as in they pay attention to the news, of those quarter, we know that about half of them already agree with us. The research I'm quoting here comes from some work that the Gates Foundation funded last year called the Narrative Project. All of this data is publicly available. And if we look at the US, we can see that there's all these people who agree with us. But there's this second group, a group called swings, who right now don't have a view. To the extent they think about it at all, if you ever prompt them, they say, yeah, I'm a good person. Of course I believe in, saving lives or helping girls learn or making sure that there's not conflict somewhere. And then there's a much, much smaller group of skeptics. The people who believe that foreigners should fix their own problems, that we need to get out of everything, that we need to stay out of the way. Our big question is, how do we convert the swings into supporters? How do we go out and get them engaged, get them interested, not so that they can become activists who do everything we could ever want, although that would be lovely, but how do we get them to do enough so that they give the work that all of us are doing as a sector the benefit of the doubt? Because if we were to effectively double the number of people who agree in the public with the sorts of work that we're all engaged in, not only does that massively increase the number of donors everyone's potentially got, it changes the way that politics around this stuff would work. We'd still argue about pretty much everything, but we'd argue from a position of being able to at least win on a whole lot of these things, a lot more than we do right now. And so it's not going to be quick, it's not going to be easy, but what we've developed on Global Citizen is a technology platform that is experimenting and learning and testing on how to do a whole series of these things right now. Over the last 2.5 years, we've built a base of about 3.5, 4 million people who, all around the world, are learning, consuming content, taking action. They're getting involved in activism. And one of the things I wanted to share with you was some stories about success, because we know that one of the biggest things we need to do, if we're going to succeed at this, is help people see how their actions make a difference. So I want to tell you about a user that we've got. We'll call her Davinia, from here in DC. She got involved when we first started doing Global Citizen a couple of years ago. And for her, it started out with wanting to win tickets to a music show where we said, if you take a series of actions, you can enter the draw to win tickets to a show in Central Park. She wanted to go see Foo Fighters. She didn't get involved because she cared about the issues, but she was willing to sit and learn about the issues for long enough to try and work out how she could get tickets. But for us, that's an opportunity to start a conversation about the sorts of content that she consumes, the sorts of actions she takes. So by signing petitions, by going and meeting with members of Parliament, members of Congress, wrong country. By meeting with members of Congress, by signing petitions, by supporting many of the organisations that I'm sure are here in the room today, she was one of 142,000 people who are involved in a big sweep of work we did ahead of last year's replenishment for the Global Partnership for Education. Out of that, we got the American government to double their contribution from a reasonably small $20 million a year to a still reasonably small $50 million a year. And for us, the significance of that isn't just getting that extra $30 million a year from the American government. It's about making sure that people understand the life-changing benefits that well-done, well-invested foreign aid can have. And for us, we've been able to see that sweep, working with a whole range of partners, including folks like Oxfam America, the One Campaign, Save the Children, UNICEF, World Vision, the UN Foundation, and CARE, some of the folks we work with really regularly on this stuff, that we can secure multiple billions of dollars that otherwise wouldn't have been secured. We can secure policy change from business and government. But most importantly, knowing how many of us are engaged in lobbying and knowing that many of those things may well have happened anyway eventually, we can pull the public into a conversation so that they feel and they see that they've got a role in it. Because actually, if we can shift their attitudes and understanding of this stuff, the next fight and the fight after that becomes so much easier. And so, what we've got now on Global Citizen is a rapidly growing base of people. We have an ambition this year to get to 15 million people. 15 million people is a lot more than we've had in the past. It's a pretty huge challenge, but it's also a pretty huge opportunity. For us, it's one that's going to need to involve the music events that we've done in the past. It's going to need to involve the content platform that we've done in the past, but it also needs to involve a completely new and really open approach with the whole sector about what's working, what's not, and why. And so I wanted to stand here with you guys today and share a little bit about what some of our strategy is, as well as some of the big bets that we're making and the big things that we're not entirely sure about. Because as we go and we work with a whole range of people to tell this story, from influencers to celebrities to international development experts to people telling stories from the field to people working through the media to recruitment partnerships that we've got, we know that actually it only works if we can drive all of that energy and effort and attention that we can secure back to people taking action in the medium and the long term. And so what we're looking at to do that are a couple of things that I wanted to share now. The first is getting to 15 million. We actually know reasonably easily how to do. We've brokered a series of fantastic partnerships to do it. But we also know that 15 million, to be honest, won't be enough. If we get 5 to 7 million people who we can contact in America, that's going to be good, but it's still smaller than the reach of the NRA. And if we think about political influence, actually we realize you need to be in the hearts and minds of tens of millions of people. And so we're working right now on 5 main countries, the US, the UK, Canada, Australia, Germany, and to a lesser extent, France. And we realize that through the partnerships we've got, we're going to be working to do a whole lot more in places like Brazil, India, South Africa, Nigeria, where there are emergent local groups doing many of the same things who we're looking to partner up with and support. And to say that together we need to be building a movement that's tens and tens of millions of people, broad and strong. And that movement needs to be supported not just by the traditional NGOs, but it needs to also bring in the private sector. It needs to bring in the companies and businesses who, although talking to a mainstream audience might seem strange or tricky or challenging for us, is going to be absolutely essential to us being able to build a broad enough base of people who will go along with this journey. At times, that's going to mean that we're going to have to simplify some of what we say and how we say it, and it's going to be a bit difficult. Because I come from a policy and campaigning background where actually words matter. But to the public who don't know what any of these words are, actually what matters are feelings and emotions and stories. And so we're working with some of the people you can see up on the screen this year in order to be able to get this message out there. And we're doing things right now with each of them, some of which are working, some of which are not. I can tell you that the YouTube audience absolutely loves hearing from and talking to celebrities. But if any of you have ever read the comments that you get on YouTube, there are a lot of angry people on the internet. And so what we need to do is understand how do we capture what is a huge audience that wants to look at and consume and share and talk about ideas and put that in a space that isn't going to lead some of those comments to be crazy, racist, xenophobic. And we have to accept that, you know what, some of them will. But we have to have enough confidence in the stories we tell to say that, on balance, we share these sorts of stories to a really wide and broad audience, not just the people who already agree with us. We're going to be bringing in more people than we're going to be turning off and losing. The second big assumption we've got is about what the audience characteristics are going to look like. Because we know that if we're going to be converting these people from swings to supporters, most of them are going to come in and they're not going to do very much. They're going to come in and they're going to click on a few things, maybe sign a petition occasionally, but mainly they'll just like things on Facebook. We have to be okay that that's probably as much as we're going to get from them, because that's as much as we can get from most people on most issues. And actually just being able to contact them and share stories and frame the way they engage with and think about the news that they're seeing anyway, and the stories they're seeing anyway, and the cultural influences they're seeing anyway, is going to matter. And then what we need to do is maximize the number of people we can get up to this next level, the top 10% or so, who are the true activists, the ones who, if we can double the number of activists that NGOs and charities and movements on our broad set of issues have in this country, that could make a huge difference to what's winnable and what's not. And then finally, we need to make sure that we do a great job handing off that very top 1%, the people who might not be well connected into what our broad movement's doing right now, but who are actually going to be organising in their local districts, who are going to be getting out the vote, who are going to be getting in front of members of Congress and actually pushing them on these issues and helping transform where we're at. And so for us, trying to make sure that this looks like 99-1 or even better, 80-19-1 is a big challenge, because as we go out to a really broad audience, I could very easily end up with an audience that looks like 95-4-1, and that's not actually that useful. The final piece that I wanted to share is that mobilizing our audience isn't something that we can do by ourselves. At Global Poverty Project, we specialize in telling stories, and we're pretty good at telling stories. What we're not so great at, because it's not our thing to do, is doing development. We need to be working with people who are doing the best programs, people who are doing the best policy work, people who are creating and gathering the best data and research about what's working, what's not. And we need to be making sure that it's not just a bunch of Australians and Americans who are translating that and communicating that out to a bunch of Australians and Americans and British people, but they're being true about this idea of what it means to be a global citizen, that it doesn't matter where you're from, that if you've got a story to tell, we want to help convey and package that up in a way that's going to make sense to people. And that's something that we're going to need your help with as a broad sector. And so just before I close, I wanted to invite any of you who have an interest in helping get your stories out there and helping test ideas and messages and actions in terms of how we get Middle America, people who don't normally think about these issues, to start grappling with them. We're willing to try anything this year, to put it in front of an audience and see what sticks, because we realize that if we're going to win at this, we know how to get the eyeballs. What we've got to do is keep them interested, and keep them doing things. And so I'd like to finish just with a simple thought. And that is that we have, as a collective movement, I think, an amazing story to tell. We have this story about the future that we all want to create, the future that by 2030 could see effectively an end to extreme poverty, a massive reduction in inequality, a huge reduction in child mortality, an increase in gender equality, all of the things that all of our day-to-day and programming work is all about. We've got this amazing story that most of the public don't ever hear, which is one of success and progress and opportunity. And so my question is, and my thought is, how do we use this unique opportunity of 2015 and the new release of the new global goals, which, although there are 17 of them, which is too many for the public to understand, is a unique opportunity to tell a story? How do we use that to try and generate a 15-year commitment of citizens all around the world to do things? And with that, I'd love to hand over to see if anyone's got any questions.
Are there any questions? It is hard to see up here. Oh, great.
You can't see me, but I can see you. I'm sorry, I just missed a good part of your presentation, but you ended on a note which really I was pleased to see. I'm with the United Nations Association, Steve Mosley, and we've just completed 30 community-based consultations across the United States, helping citizens in the U.S. come to recognize that the issues globally are also in their own backyard for two reasons. One, we think we ought to be more attentive and sensitive to what happens in Baltimore and Ferguson and so forth and so on. But more importantly, that the likelihood that anybody's going to engage globally beyond the 10% that got engaged in the MDGs probably depends upon them being able to recognize themselves in the equation in their own neighborhoods. So I want to know how you think we could be even more effective or partner to make it likely that we could engage millions of people in this process. They have to be a little bit oriented to these issues, but we've found that so far those who are working domestically on these issues get very excited that they have a mirror to connect with globally. Thank you.
Yeah, great question, Steve. We've been running a whole bunch of what I'd call content tests over the last little while, which is we publish about 45 stories a week, written both by our internal editorial team and by NGO partners like you guys. And consistently, the stories that perform best are actually the ones that link local issues to global ones. So when we had the riots in Baltimore a couple of weeks ago, Jon Stewart said something just in his show, which was a throwaway line which we picked up, which was Jon Stewart said that, look, we've spent like $1 trillion on schools in Afghanistan. Why don't we send some of that money to, you know, like Baltimore? And obviously, we're all very aware that nothing like $1 trillion has gone to Afghanistan. But at a very practical level, it was a good example for us to be able to jump in and say, actually, guys, this isn't an either-or thing. This is actually about fairness everywhere. And what we've learnt so far from doing that is it's incredibly effective if you can link the two stories together, but it is political dynamite. Because if you say the wrong thing about a local issue, you will, I was going to swear, not allowed to swear. You'll annoy a whole lot of people who you actually want to keep on side. And so what we've learned is that you've got much more space to talk about fairness when it's other people than when it's our people. And so I'd say that the more that all of us can do that connection, but also the more we probably need to get in with some of our fellow people who are working on local issues to understand the political nuances so that we don't put our foot in it as we make that connection is going to be key. And it's also possibly about recognising that maybe from time to time we need to say some things that rock the boat a little more if we're going to actually try and get traction on our issues. Because simply being the nice thing over there that everyone agrees with in principle but no one ever gets close enough to really have a good look at probably isn't going to be sufficient, I would say, for us to achieve the bigger long-term goals of trying to transform the way that America and America's political system engages on what I'd call sort of bigger than self multilateral common good problems.
Any other questions? Great.
Thank you. Hey, fantastic talk, and thank you so much. My first comment was sign me up. I'm a fan. I'm Kate from Deloitte, Kate Thompson. And my question is, the young, the youth, they seem to have a very different perspective about these issues. They're much more engaged, or seemingly so. Are they the tipping point? Or are their opinions going to change at the next economic downturn, or when they get to be 30 and are getting a job and paying taxes? Are they the tipping point, or could they be the tipping point? How do they factor into the equation?
Yeah, so I'm going to go probably beyond what the evidence suggests to what I think it means. We honestly don't know yet, because the millennials who grew up as digital natives are my age, and they're not yet old enough to know if their attitudes are going to change. The data we've seen suggests that, yes, there is actually a bit of a generational gap. It's not like, you know, old people are awful and young people are great. Right? There's a slow gradient over time, which seems to be related to the amount of travel that people have done, the amount of education people have had, and their exposure to what I'd call broadly international issues. And growing up digital first means that what I'd call the current group of sort of 15 to particularly sort of 28, 29-year-olds tend to have more connections that are more global than people who are, say, 30 to 45. Now, I think that's an opportunity. I don't think that's a guarantee. And certainly what we've seen so far is, one, given that it's virtually impossible to get young people to vote in large numbers, there is limited use in trying to only engage young people if they're then not going to actually use their voice politically at any point. And so we need to be looking really across the spectrum. The one that I would say for the sort of work that we're doing, and this is borne out by the experience that the One campaign and others have had, is that actually women aged between 30 and 45 are the most active action takers. And so it's not just young mothers, but it's a group that includes a large number of young mothers who are typically reasonably well educated, somewhat worldly, but who also, through having, whether it's a family or connection, tend to be much better at this. And for all the blokes out there, actually only about 30% of the audience that you're typically talking to is engaged are men. It is overwhelmingly female. And we can't tell you why, other than maybe women are nicer than men.
I'll go with that. Any other? Over here?
Hi, I'm Kate Thomas from SID-Washington, not to be confused with Kate Thompson. My question is just about how you're taking this big audience and connecting it with organizations like ours. Could you just talk a little bit more about that connection and how that happens and maybe how that content gets transferred back and forth?
Sure. So we have 7 major NGO partners who we're on the phone with pretty much every other day, who are supplying us a somewhat steady stream of content, actions, etc. And we work with them because, 1, we had a long-standing history with them, and 2, they covered the range of issues that we look at, which broadly speaking is sort of the MDG/SDG universe. We've then got about another 3 dozen content and action partners who, from time to time, as they've got relevant things that they want to share, will send them to us. And we've got a staff team of 3 content people who spend their time commissioning, editing, and writing content, both internally and from partners, as well as an actions team and a digital campaigns team who look after all of our social media and emails, of another 3-4 people who do that. So if anyone is interested, either come up and chat to me at the end, or feel free to, Catherine, send out my email. We have a process. It's all relational. It's not done by forms or anything. It's just about us saying, hey, if you've got a story that you'd like to tell. Now, what we are very aware of with the sort of audience we've got is, if you've got a particular policy-focused, really narrow field that is reasonably technical, it probably won't perform that well with our audience, which is reasonably mainstream. That doesn't mean we're not willing to try some stuff, because one of the things we are learning is that you can often say some pretty complex things to people if you just make sure you take the time to unpack what are they likely to know and what are they likely to find interesting out of what you're doing. And so we're really thrilled, and we need to be working with people who are actually out there doing that work. And certainly if we're releasing 40 to 50 stories a week, sort of 35 written ones and 10 or so video ones, we don't have that many good ideas. We don't have that many good stories. What we do is we respond to the news and connect it back up to our broad agenda. We help shape the news in terms of the campaigns that we know NGOs are already running, but that means we need to be constantly linked into what people are doing. So if any of you have ideas, then please let me know later.
Great. Now, I apologize, I can't see very well, so are there any other questions? Okay, great.
Hi, thank you for being here. My name's Grace. I'm young, I'm 23, I'm engaged, I'm encouraged, I'm excited, and I have no idea how to get my friends to do the same. What do I do?
Good question. This is one of the trickiest problems that I think our sector faces. From what we've seen is that this is a psychographic issue, not a demographic one. It's about how people feel about themselves and their community. The first thing we realise is not everyone wants to be an activist, and even if they've got friends who are, who they support because they're their friends, it's not necessarily going to be enough. What we've tried, one is when we do events, like the little bit of the footage from the Global Citizen Festival I showed, we realise that experiences drive particularly young people's understanding of the world. So the more that we can create space for friends to experience some of what we might all feel, the better it goes. So if we run a live event, we'll always give you 2 tickets, not 1, so that you can bring a friend. You're the one who did all the campaigning and activism to get here, but actually your friend can come. Because if we can have them in an event for 6 hours where really they're there to listen to the music from the band they liked, but they also see half a dozen great films and a bunch of other things, that's one step. The second is the sort of campaigning that NGOs do. When people have an opportunity to actually talk to you as a friend rather than hear from some NGO, that's much more likely to actually work. So we run an experiential campaign with about 30 charities here in the US called Live Below the Line. And it challenges people to spend 5 days living on $1.50 a day for food and drink, which is the purchasing power equivalent of what $1.25 is. And one of the big things we've picked up from that, we originally didn't start it as any sort of fundraiser. We started it as a peer-to-peer way of trying to get people to talk about the issues, because we realized when people did it for 5 days, they were having on average 30 to 50 conversations with other people about it. And they were having much more genuine conversations than we could ever have. Because when an NGO says something, it's a broadcast. It's very difficult to be two-way. And although it pains me as a communications guy to let go of the message and to trust thousands and thousands of normal people out there to say the right thing, because they don't, actually, they're much better at conveying the emotion, the connection, the values that I care about, and the facts don't really matter. Whether it's 800 million or 900 million people going to bed hungry tonight doesn't matter to the average person. What matters is it's unfair. It doesn't need to be that way. We have the ability to change it. And I, as a person, care about it, and I'm inviting you as my friend to understand a bit about why I care. So I don't have one big solution. What I have are sort of many little solutions that we on Global Citizen aren't anywhere near yet fully capitalizing on, which is to say, how do we equip people with the tools to start conversations? Whether that's about stories, whether that's about experiences, whether that's about events, I think we're going to need all of them, and different contexts will work for different things. But actually, this is ultimately about person-to-person conversations, because that's what's going to drive the biggest change in the friends of all of the people who already agree with us.
We have a question over here. It's coming. The mic is coming. My staff is getting their exercise.
Hi, Linda Nimick in the Bonte Group. I just put 2 kids through college, my own, and it just really struck me about how many of their friends and how many folks go overseas to work or experience that, and I would just think that there would be some kind of opportunity there, because when they come back, they're not all joining the Peace Corps or international development, but there seemed to be an awful lot of interest in improving the world.
Completely agree. And one of the things we're trying this year is, how do you go out and get them, not in a way that is controlled by us and is like, okay, they've got to be a member of us and no one else. One of the things we're seeing is that people, when they come back from those experiences, will often have pretty niche interests. They'll have fallen in love with a particular country or a particular issue, or sometimes a particular person. And what they're interested in then is to say, and we see this a lot, they reject the concept of international development, and they say, but you know what, I can help this school, because they often come back with very jaded views of quality governance in other countries, and sometimes America as well. They often come back with a very practical, grounded sense of, I want to do something. And one of the things that we tend to be pretty bad at, I'd say, is creating space for people to feel as though their personal interest can be a part of this much, much bigger thing, instead of it being defined in opposition to. So one of the things we're trying to work out is, how do you create that space for people to feel, okay about saying, I care about this one thing. I'm not actually going to get involved in this charity or that charity or that charity because I want to pursue it in my own way, but actually that ladders up to something that's much bigger and, big picture political, about saying, but I care about our role in the world. We haven't worked out exactly the best way to do that. We're trying some experiments at the moment about how do you let those people tell their stories and ask them the sorts of questions that help them connect up their individual experience to a bigger piece. It's not easy. Some people get it and some people don't. And I can't tell you the number of really distressing conversations I've had where people come back and I'm lecturing at a college somewhere and someone says, I was just in Togo and they didn't have shoes, so I collected all of my friends' spare shoes and we're sending them to them. And it's really tough to say, there's a much better way of doing that. And what we've got to realize is actually just telling them that they're wrong actually turns them off doing this stuff for life. And instead what we need to do is try and create space for them to think through and go, okay, maybe is there a better way of achieving the outcome we want without shipping lots of second-hand shoes to a community that may or may not actually want or need them.
Great, over here.
Krista Ridley, formerly with Oxfam, worked with Paul. I wanted to ask about social media, and sorry I missed the beginning of the presentation, but we know that there's a lot of noise in social media, so how do you sort of rise above that in your work to get people engaged through that medium? Or is it that it really is that person-to-person contact you were talking about with the concerts or with events or things like that?
My flippant answer is Malala. My serious answer is that social media is a brilliant way for people to curate what they're interested in. And the great thing about social media is we can post 50 to 100 times a week on Twitter, and we can post 40 to 50 times a week on Facebook without reducing the reach of what we're doing. So that's 40 to 50 individual tests every week to see what sticks and what doesn't stick. And what we've seen is that actually, increasingly, particularly for younger people, social media becomes how they consume news and how they find out about the world. And actually, the act of liking is like, oh, I'm interested in this, and the act of sharing is I want my friends to know about it. And so it's actually a really fantastic way of doing it, but what it means is that we have to cede a lot of the control we'd normally want as a corporate communications channel. So instead of it being about what do we want to tell them about, it's relentlessly asking, what are they interested in? And our job is then to connect what the audience is interested in, which it turns out is Malala. Anything, you put a photo of Malala on the internet and suddenly everyone on Facebook seems to think it's fantastic. And actually the reason for that is because there's a story and a person they can connect with. It's no longer girls' education or conflict and terrorism. It's a girl who's 17, who everyone knows the name of, whose story everyone knows, and who is a symbol for something that everyone can then connect to. So we did put a Malala quote up last weekend, and it got 13,000 likes and like 5,000 shares. And we were astonished because, you know, normally we don't get a response anywhere like that unless you're like trying to get the president to change some policy to something and you actually win. And so what I think we're seeing is that if you use your channels to test that, you need to be clear on who your audience is. Actually, it can be a really good way of engaging, but it is noisy. And you've got to accept that a lot of what you do is going to sink. That if you want something to cut through, you've probably got to say it to your audience 5 or 7 times because we have pretty good engagement. A typical post that we put out gets seen by about 25 to 60% of our audience. But that means that you've probably got to say something 4 times to be sure that they've seen them, but we also know that a lot of those people will be the same people who click on everything that you do because they seem to be really into it. And so I would say, use it, experiment, do that, but also be aware that it's not like say the newsletters or the magazines that many of us have put out in the past where we could reasonably assume that most of our donors or supporters, if they got that, would probably actually look at most of it. We have to assume that most of what goes out on any form of social media is not seen by the vast majority of our audience. And so you've got to keep trialing, keep saying it, keep repeating it.
We probably have time for one more question. Is there one back there?
Thanks for being the last one. Hi, Simon. I'm Colleen Sorto from Conservation International, and I think what you just presented is hugely exciting, especially because you gather stories from different organizations. And I was just wondering if you could speak to how branded is each of the pieces and stories that you tell? And then what level of sort of checking in with the other organizations that you work with do you do in terms of telling everybody's different stories and if there's multiple partners on one project, et cetera?
So my answer to that will possibly scare a few people. The public don't overly care about any of our brands. We've tested a number of different ways of doing it, and they're much more interested in seeing the story and the headline than they're in seeing any of our logos. So we put, for any story that's provided by a partner, it goes directly in the byline. It goes, you know, big picture, big title, little author name, little partner name. And what we've seen from people is that they like the credibility that comes with an organisation, but typically the public don't like things being about an organisation. So the ideal character in a story is a person, a single person, ideally a young, good-looking woman, but sadly that's how the internet works. Ideally a person who can talk about how maybe they've worked with an organization or how they like an organization, but typically not that organization talking. So even if you wanted to talk about your own organization, it's better to have a staff member talk in their own voice than it is to talk in corporate language. And so that's the first bit of that we've tested a whole bunch of different approaches. No better way to make your story tank than to put your organization's name in the title. Public just don't seem to care. We did a piece with UNICEF a little while ago where we tested, and I won't get the numbers exactly right, but we tested sort of like 6 things you need to know about saving kids' lives, or 6 things you need to know about UNICEF saving kids' lives. The one without UNICEF performed 3 or 4 times better, because people associate that with brand, and for some reason that's not as interesting. The second bit of that is we share a whole bunch of our data really openly with a whole bunch of people, because we recognize what we're in a reasonably unique position to do, I hope, is to help all of us work out how to talk to the public. Now, we recognize that talking to the public is one of many stakeholder groups that we all have. We have influencer groups, we have donor groups and other key stakeholders and people overseas, but to the extent we care about talking to those people out there, the normal people in the world who are either helping to fund our work or create political space for our work. If anyone would like to get data about what's working, what's not, we're absolutely up for sharing that. We're not going to put it completely in the public domain, but what we are willing to do is privately share it in settings like this, show people numbers on what's working, what's not, what are the differences between different groups, and we regularly share that, particularly with the 7 partners we work with all the time, and we work with the others in an on-demand kind of way, particularly around doing things like that UNICEF test I mentioned, where we're more than happy to actually go out and put up 2 different versions of a story or put up 2 different headlines, push them out to an audience and see which one sticks and which one doesn't, because we thankfully have enough latitude, knowing that most people don't see most things on social media, and knowing that if you're publishing 50 things a week, if 2 of them are actually the same, no one really notices and no one really cares, but we can learn a lot from doing that.
Great. Thank you very much, Simon. Really interesting.
Thank you, Simon. And I hope all of us consider becoming global citizens after hearing today's presentation. So this formally ends today's conference. We want to thank everybody for attending. We will see everyone across the hall at the wine and cheese reception. And we would just like to take 1 second to thank all of the speakers, the participants, and the SID staff for all they have done to make today possible. So thank you all. So we'll see you across the hall.